All right, welcome everybody to the Friends of the Cabildos member lecture series, and this is our second week of 6 of our Unknown Legends series. So, if you missed last week, I hope you signed up and got the recording. If not, you can always email me, Jason at friendsofthecabildo.org, and I can always send you a copy. It's free for members, and if you're not a member, it's just $10 to watch it. You can become a member for as little as $40. So if you plan on attending a lot, multiple of these throughout the year, $40 is a really cheap and easy way to get all these. Just to give you an update on what we have coming up as part of this series, Charles will be back next week to talk about the Goodson sisters. Charles, any tease you can say about the Goodson sisters?
Well, I will just say that it's a fascinating story of female pianists beginning in the 1920s. We're going to cover a little bit of that tonight as kind of a tease to the Goodson sisters. So stay tuned.
Yep. And then August 3rd, Dave Thomas is going to be talking about the story of Clarence Williams. And then he'll return on the 17th talking about the same last name, but non-related, Spencer Williams. And then in between there, August 10th, Charles is going to be talking about the Latin influence of New Orleans music. And if you haven't gone to our webpage, we literally have lectures like this going starting August 24th all the way through November 9th. And we've even got a couple more to announce. So until November 9th, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 different lectures. So I hope you will attend some more. And as always, we'll do the chat at the end. Always put your chats in the chat box as we're going along, and so that we can ask them at the end. Other than that, our presenter tonight again is Dr. Charles Chamberlain, professor of history at the University of New Orleans, former historian at the museum, guitar player, and the new Leviathan.
Oriental Foxtrot Orchestra.
What was it, Charles?
Oriental Foxtrot Orchestra.
Oriental Foxtrot. Sorry, I have missed you guys last year at Jazz Fest. So I have Oriental Foxtrot Jazz Band and tour guide and FOC board member as well. So with that, I will let Charles talk about the 1920 dance bands of New Orleans. Thanks, Charles.
Well, thank you, Jason. Appreciate it. So welcome everybody to tonight's lecture, 1920s Dance Bands of New Orleans, Local and Regional Dance Boom of the Jazz Age. And before you all came on, Jason and I were talking. This is a subject that I have researched beginning when I worked at the Hogan Jazz Archive back in the late 90s and early 2000s. And this is a time period that's largely overlooked in New Orleans music history and jazz history. New Orleans gets a lot of credit as the birthplace of jazz, and then most of the focus then moves on to Chicago and New York and other locations. And then by the 1930s, Kansas City and the Territory bands and Count Basie. But the 1920s in New Orleans was a very interesting time. So we're going to explore that tonight. So as always, I like to begin with discussing further research and reading for those who are interested. And I would like to correct a statement I made last week, and that is, I suggested that you all try to search for the Jazz Archivist, the journal of the Hogan Jazz Archive. And I said that I was not able to find it online, but I went deeper today and actually found that it does exist online. And it's this link right here, the digital library at tulane.edu. And so they have all of the numbers and volumes over the years. And so that brings up the fact that I think the Hogan archive, and by the way, as an aside, I just read today that under curator Melissa Weber, known as DJ Soul Sister, she has made an initiative that has been accepted to change the name to broaden the subject matter, which I think is great. And that's part of her appeal as a DJ artist. And so the new name, as you see here, is the Hogan Archive of New Orleans music and New Orleans jazz. And so they have, I would say, the two great series they have related to this topic are, number one, the Oral History Collection, And then the Music Rising website actually has the links to the digital versions of these oral histories. And so in the 1950s and 60s, the original founders, Bill Russell and Dick Allen, interviewed many of the original jazz musicians from New Orleans. And so some of the ones that would pertain to tonight's lecture would include in the collection Isaiah Morgan, Bebe Ridgely, Emmanuel Sales, Edmund Hall, and Captain John Handy. And again, the link is right here. And then the Jazz Archivist Journal, which I mentioned, and then the link is right here. And so right here on the side here, I took a screenshot of an article that I published dealing with this subject right here. It was way back in 2000. That was a long time ago. But the name of the article was Searching for the Gulf Coast Circuit, Mobility and Cultural Diffusion in the Age of Jim Crow, 1900 to 1930. And there are other articles that I submitted to the Jazz Archivist that also kind of covered this time period. A couple books that I would recommend that also cover this time period is Danny Barker's A Life in Jazz, published in 1986, and there's the picture, and then also Lee Collins' Oh Didn't He Ramble, the life story of Lee Collins. So I'd like to begin tonight, beyond the further research, by setting the kind of the context of the history, and that is the creation or the promotion of the Storyville Exodus myth. And some of you all that have seen my previous lectures have seen me present this clip from the movie New Orleans in 1947, starring Louis Armstrong and Billie Holiday and Dorothy Patrick and Arthur Cordova. And so I'm not going to play this scene. I'm not going to really waste our time on Hollywood's version of what happened. But it is a great scene, and I encourage you all to watch it on YouTube anytime. But Farewell to Storyville is the song, and basically the idea is that according to the movie New Orleans and early jazz historians, when the Navy closed Storyville in 1917, all the jazz musicians left the city, and then there was no more jazz in New Orleans, and there were no more music opportunities. There was no more market to play jazz because, according to those historians and Hollywood, Storyville was the only market in town. And that is completely false. And I will say that this myth came from the book that I'm circling here in the right-hand corner, and that is Jazzmen by Fred Ramsey and Charles Edward Smith, published in, I believe, 1939. And it was the first jazz history. And they were very biased. They came to New Orleans in the late 30s looking for what they wanted to see, which is the music from 1917. They didn't find it. And so they said, there's no music scene in the city. And then ironically, Charles Edward Smith writes an article about, I went and saw Joe Robichaux, and I saw, he names a number of musicians who are, I consider, great jazz musicians, Fats Pichon, and he basically says there's no jazz scene, and that the radio killed it, the development of the lakefront killed it, and so in his opinion, New Orleans was completely depressed and decrepit of jazz, which again, that's part of the myth that developed, and so especially people of the post-World War II generation who may have watched this movie or read Jazzmen, they believed it. What is interesting to me is, as I teach New Orleans music history to a younger crowd, Generation Z or whatever you want to call them, the current college-age kids, none of them know this myth. And so I'm almost afraid to tell them about it. But anyway, it sets up tonight, and that is the idea that after 1917, New Orleans had no music scene, when in fact, there was a huge dance band boom in the 1920s. And so we're going to explore that tonight. And so that includes, I'm going to kind of go through the list quickly here, the tango belt in the French Quarter basically kind of inherited the role of Storyville after Storyville closed in 1917. So just as an aside, part of city reformers' agenda was to basically kind of contain the prostitution profession in Storyville. And then when Storyville closed, essentially a lot of that prostitution moved over across Rampart Street into the kind of the back of the French Quarter. And so the Tango Belt is the kind of the uptown backside of the French Quarter. There was also the riverboat trade, where riverboat excursions were really big business. And so people would go on day trips, or sometimes riverboats with bands would visit towns along their route. And so this provided a lot of opportunities for dance bands as well. And then going through some of the more popular dance bands that we're going to talk about tonight. So that would include the Halfway House Orchestra, which was comprised of remnants of New Orleans Rhythm Kings, one of the probably the considered the best of the all white bands of the late teens and 1920s from New Orleans. Sam Morgan's band, Morgan Brothers, originally from Plaquemines Parish, moved to New Orleans in the 19-teens, and became one of the most popular bands along the Gulf Coast. As one jazz musician said, Sam Morgan kept the Gulf Coast hot. And then Oscar Papacelistan, his original Tuxedo Band and Orchestra, originally from Assumption Parish, where that's in South Central Louisiana, sugarcane country. And then William Bebe Ridgely and his orchestra. He's from Shrewsbury and Jefferson Parish. And then there's the Gulf Coast Circuit, which Sam Morgan and others really opened up in terms of a regional kind of territorial band circuit. So that would include, they would do a weekly circuit from New Orleans, Mobile, Pensacola, and all the towns in between. And then at the same time, and this is a teaser for next week, we have the rise of female pianists, and that would include Jeanette Kimball from Pass Christian, who played with Tuxedo, the Goodson sisters, Sadie, Billy Pierce, and Ida, who played with a number of bands, and then Sweet Emma Barrett, who also played with Bebe Ridgely. And then lastly on this list, we have Louis Prima, Frank Federico, and Tony Parenti, as you have a generation of Sicilian Americans who their parents were Sicilian immigrants. They are coming of age as Americans and performing in jazz bands in the 1920s. So starting off, the Tango Belt, which I call here the successor to Storyville, includes a number of dance halls, the Pup Cafe and the Fern Dance Hall and the 1000 block of Iberville, the Doghouse at the corner of North Rampart and Bienville, the Orchard on 900 Conti, the Cadillac Club at 300 North Rampart, and the Budweiser, which I'm not sure of the address, but I did include a quote from the Hogan Archive interview with Sal Gutierrez, where he makes this claim. He says, the women in the Budweiser, there was a bunch of characters. There was Broken Dishes. That was her name. And then Fazola's broad, that's Irving Fazola, the great clarinetist, was Bebe. She was little. And the big shot guys, they'd pick up the girls in the front, but that love, it ain't for keeps. And so most of these dance halls were known for their jitney dances, which is like a taxi dance, which is where essentially at the time you would pay a woman, essentially a man would pay a woman 10 cents or so, a dime, to dance with her. And so that was kind of the persona of those dance halls. And then I will also add that some of y'all are probably familiar with the book The Last Madam, about the story of Hilma Burt, who operated a brothel in this block of Conti, the 1000 block of Conti, up until the 1950s. And this is a picture of her as well. And so that is kind of the last of the hangovers from these days of the Tango Belt. And what happened was, in 1933, 34, with Prohibition ending under the New Deal, the city basically developed Bourbon Street as the new entertainment district. And so the Tango Belt basically faded out, but still very important in terms of the 1920s. So also I wanted to include riverboat and lake excursions. And the Streckfus line was very important. It was a company based out of St. Louis. The Streckfus brothers owned a number of boats, but there were other boats. So this is a picture of the great J.S. Streckfus boat on the Mississippi River. And then down here is the Madisonville, which used to work the Lake Pontchartrain circuit. So here's a map of New Orleans from the 19 teens, but this lasted in the 1920s, and especially when we look at the story of Sadie Goodson from Pensacola. Next week, we're going to talk about the importance of the Madisonville as a place for local music. But I did want to say that this map of New Orleans shows both West End and Muhlenberg as departure points for the North Shore. And so for people in New Orleans in the 1920s, going to the lakefront and taking a ferry to the North Shore for the day was considered a big weekend excursion. And so on the boat on the Madisonville would be a local jazz band performing. And so both on the river and the lake, we would have these boats providing that. And then, of course, here's a very famous picture of the Fate Marable Band, which worked on the Streckfus boats from the late 19 teens till the early 1920s. And this is where Louis Armstrong got a lot of his formal musical training as he worked for the Streckfus boats. And I would say that in regards to the movie New Orleans, in the movie in 1917, the character Satch, when Storyville closes, moves to Chicago. Well, the real Satch lived in New Orleans all the way until 1921, but part of his time was actually working the Streckfus riverboats in the summers. And so he would take the train to St. Louis, and then the boats would ply generally the upper Mississippi River. So in this band were some of the great jazz musicians from New Orleans, including Louis Armstrong, you can see here, Baby Dodds on drums, Johnny St. Cyr on banjo, and Pops Foster on bass. And there's Fate Marable at the piano. So there's other pictures of them, but I think it's very important to point out the role of the riverboats. So that brings up a number of bands that we're going to explore here over the next half hour or so. And so the New Orleans Rhythm Kings, I'm not going to really get into them, but they do cover the early 1920s. And so they were formed in Chicago, comprised of a number of Jack Lane's Reliance Band veterans. So Jack Lane's Reliance Band was a brass band operating mostly in the uptown area from these immigrant American kids. And so the members of the band included Paul Merez, Leon Rapolo, George Bruni, Steve Brown, and more. And so Clarinet Marmalade is kind of one of their more famous songs. And so that features Leon Rapolo, considered one of the great clarinetists of the early New Orleans jazz period. And they recorded for Jeanette Records, including sessions with Jelly Roll Morton. So they were essentially racially integrated. And Jelly Roll Morton claimed he was Spanish in order to allow that to happen when they recorded in Indiana. And so I encourage you all to check those songs out. I'm not going to play that in part because they formed in Chicago and it was recorded in Indiana. But they have a big influence. And then also it's important because they formed the remnants of the NORK, the New Orleans Rhythm Kings, formed the Halfway House Orchestra, which was probably one of the most popular of the white jazz bands in the 1920s in New Orleans. And so here's a picture of them with Charlie Cordilla on tenor, and here's Leon Rapolo playing alto. And I would like to move to the next slide, and this is the actual Halfway House. And so the Halfway House was a dance hall that was located halfway between New Orleans and Lake Pontchartrain along the New Basin Canal, which is the corridor, for those of you all who do not know, it was filled in the 1950s, but this is the corridor for the Pontchartrain Expressway. And then this part right here, if you follow the cursor, is West End Boulevard, and then you can see the lakefront out here, and that's Jefferson Parish in the background on the left. And this is Lake Lawn Cemetery, and then the cemeteries of Upper Canal Street. But the Halfway House was located right here at the corner of Pontchartrain Boulevard and Old Metairie Road. And here is the classic picture of the Halfway House. and some kids hanging out in front. Unfortunately, it was torn down around, I want to say 2000, and Orkin, pesticide company, owned the spot, and there was a lot of push from jazz historians, and particularly Bob Ice, who was a jazz historian who really wanted to push for the preservation of the halfway house, and unfortunately it was torn down. So one of those tragedies in New Orleans jazz history. But the Halfway House Orchestra did feature Leon Rapolo, again, one of the greatest clarinetists. Here's a picture on the right of David Cooney, the Louisiana State Museum music curator, holding a clarinet donated from one of Leon Rapolo's descendants. There's a picture of Leon right there. And then here's a great picture of Rap, as he was known, play guitar. And then this says Prima, Pesk, and I'm not sure these was, but this is apparently Louis Prima. And to me, this looks like it's somewhere out of the lakefront. And indeed, back in those days, the lakefront was kind of a hangout for anyone who wanted to cool off in the summertime before air conditioning, and especially for jazz bands. And so that would make sense. Now, honestly, I did not know that Leon Rapolo played guitar. Maybe he's just messing around in this photo, but he is considered one of the great clarinetists, and he grew up uptown. If you are familiar with Le Bon Temps Roulé Bar, there's a historic marker on the side of that, basically announcing that that was his father's grocery store. And also, it's important to recognize again that these were the kids of Sicilian immigrants who had become Americanized. And Bruce Rayburn, the former curator of the Hogan Archive, wrote a great article that's in the Jazz Archivist about how Jewish and Italian kids being somewhat marginalized in New Orleans really felt a draw to the jazz music at that time. And so here we go, where I'm going to play you a sample of the Halfway House Orchestra Barataria, recorded for OK Records in 1925. Here we go. So here comes Leon Rapolo's solo on clarinet. And notice how the drum is playing a heavy beat on the 2 and 4 on the out chorus. Ba, 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 ba. So I love that version. And Barataria, of course, a reference to Barataria Bay. I did want to point out that the rhythm is pre-swing, and it's still the foxtrot era, that the kind of hangover the 19 teens in terms of the rhythm is bum 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 bum, pretty much a straight four, as opposed to a swing, which is ching 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 ching, which comes in by the 1930s. And then also, as I mentioned, the out chorus, where the drum plays heavy on the 2 and 4. Ba, 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 ba. So that was typical of jazz of this time period before World War II, where the last chorus, the drummer would give heavy emphasis. And that's when it really starts to rock, in my opinion. And sure enough, so rock and roll basically adapted that heavy beat throughout the entire song, whereas jazz would generally just do the heavy beat at the very end of the out chorus. So another band of this time period is the Louis Prima Orchestra. And as I mentioned, Louis Prima was friends with Rapolo. And so Louis Prima grew up in Tremé. He dropped out of Warren Easton in the late 1920s and wanted to become a jazz musician. And his parents were not happy, being very conservative Sicilian immigrants. And then later he was discovered by Guy Lombardo while working on Bourbon Street. But here's a great picture of his orchestra from around 1930. And you can see how young he looks over here on the left. And it's got that kind of 1920s tuxedo look, and also the arrangement of instruments. And unfortunately, they were never recorded, but that's part of the early history of Louis Prima. And that brings us to A.J. Piron Society Orchestra and Brass Band from the 19 teens and 1920s. And so A.J. Piron was kind of the premier Creole of color orchestra leader during this time period in the 1920s. And he played, many society balls, and he would play the Southern Yacht Club. He was also known for playing Antoine's Restaurant Japan Room up on the upper level of Antoine's. And they moved to New York in the mid 1920s. I'm going to load this up. And they recorded for Victor. And so they were one of the first New Orleans bands after the kind of big wave of the initial King Oliver, ODJB recording sessions. And what I think is really significant about their recording, especially Kiss Me Sweet, which I'm about to play, is it's the first New Orleans jazz song I'm aware of that actually features vocals. And so New Orleans jazz in general is really characterized by a lack of vocals, so mostly instrumentation, very similar to what we heard with the Halfway House Orchestra. So Kiss Me Sweet, as far as I know, is the first New Orleans jazz vocal song, but that becomes the standard, in part because Louis Armstrong makes that style popular after he leaves King Oliver's band in 1925. So Louis Armstrong really makes the singing popular, but here's Kiss Me Sweet. I'm going to play it all the way through. I love it.
Kiss me sweet. I'm longing for affection. Kiss me sweet. I'm filled with temptation. Honey, when you press your lovely lips to mine, I feel a phony feeling creeping down my spine. Kiss me now. Can't wait any longer. Show me how. But what could be more fonder? With your arms around me tight. And looking in your eyes so bright. My love's complete. Honey, when you kiss me sweet.
So great song. Oops, sorry. So I also included West Indies blues, but I'm not going to play that. We don't have time. But Kiss Me Sweet, in terms of the vocal style, is very interesting because it's pre Louis Armstrong. It's almost like an Irish tenor. And then you have the male and female parts, but it's almost comedic in the way they do that. So great song. A.J. Piron, one of the great orchestra leaders of the 1920s. The story is that his band, when they moved to New York, they thought it was too cold and the food was terrible. So they headed back home. And so then they continued to play in New Orleans. And so the idea initially was that they were going to make it big and stay in New York, but none of the musicians supported that idea. So that brings us to Papa Celastan's original Tuxedo Orchestra. And that also brings in the theme of the female pianist. And so, as I mentioned, next week with the Goodson sisters, we're really going to explore this more deeply. But in the 1920s, most New Orleans jazz bands, and that would also include King Oliver's Creole Orchestra, hired female pianists who were trained in piano in part from the middle class culture, middle class Victorian culture, where families who wanted to aspire to some status would have a piano in their home, and one of the daughters of the home would be able to perform piano. And then when friends would come over, or guests or whoever, the daughter would then perform the latest sheet music, and then that would be entertainment. It'd be the equivalent of putting on whatever music today on your stereo or your Bluetooth or whatever you have it. So anyway, Jeanette Kimball is in the center here. She's from Pass Christian. There's a picture of her here in the 1950s, and an amazing picture of them from 1928. And that also reflects the fact that she's from Pass Christian, and the fact that the original Tuxedo also worked the Gulf Coast circuit and then found her in Pass Christian. So here is the original Tuxedo Orchestra playing Papa's Got the Jim Jams. And again, this is 1927. So this is at a time period, and I wanted to mention this is very important, when recording companies, Victor, Columbia, Brunswick, came down to New Orleans seeking talent as part of the jazz dance craze nationally. So they figured if New Orleans is the birthplace of jazz, then New Orleans must have some good jazz bands currently. So they came down, they recorded a few bands, including Papa Celastan's original Tuxedo Orchestra. And so Papa's Got the Jim Jams is, I think, noteworthy in part because of the vocals. Again.
the dim jams, I wanna tell her what to do. I mean to let her know who's who. Hey, hey. Papa got the dim jams, he had them since Saturday night. When I went to the show to fight no more. When I come back, she was in the door. Hey, hey. Papa got the dim jams, Papa got the dim jams now. Hey, hey, hey. Papa got the dim jams, I said. Mama got the dim jams, I wanna tell her what to do. I mean to let her know who's who. Hey, hey. Papa got the dim jams, he had them since Saturday night. Well, I like your style, your pretty hair, but that don't get Papa anywhere. Hey, hey. Papa got the dim jams, Papa got the dim jams now.
So unfortunately, I'm going to stop it there to make time for the other ones. Oh gosh, let's see. All right. Sorry, it takes a while to get through these videos. Anyway, that also brings up Bebe Ridgely's orchestra, and he had actually hired Sweet Emma Barrett as a young lady in her 20s to play with him. And some of you all may be familiar with Sweet Emma Barrett as the pianist for Preservation Hall from the 60s and 70s into the 80s. So this is part of this trend overall. Unfortunately, they didn't record. And then also there's Manuel Perez, who was a trumpet player. And this is a great picture. It's one of my favorite pictures of this time period of them playing a dance at the Pythian Temple roof garden. So the Pythian Temple on Loyola Street, right across from the public library, recently been renovated. I also saw where B. Mike, the great mural artist, had been commissioned to create a number of paintings to depict this time period at the Pythian Temple roof garden. So in the back here on the balcony, we see Manuel Perez's orchestra, and then also it includes Jeanette Kimball in the 1920s. And so an amazing picture of an African-American dance party, and very sophisticated from that time period. And then that brings up Sam Morgan's band, who, according to jazz musicians, kept the Gulf Coast hot. So Sam, along with his brothers Isaiah and Andrew, moved up from Plaquemines Parish in the 1920s. So they grew up in the country and they settled in the French Quarter. And then they were known for touring the Gulf Coast on the Gulf Coast Circuit, which included New Orleans, Bogalusa, Pass Christian, Gulfport, Biloxi, Mobile, Pensacola. Unfortunately, Sam suffered a stroke in 1932, and then Isaiah and Andrew continued to lead bands. And then in terms of the historic sites, Andrew Morgan lived at 919 St. Peter's. And so as I said, they settled in the French Quarter, in part because the French Quarter at that time in the 19 teens and 20s was the cheapest place in town. It was largely a Black and Italian neighborhood. And there's a picture of Andrew right there. They recorded with Columbia Records, again, part of this wave of national record companies moving down to New Orleans and then recording. And so what I would like to play, I love Bogalusa Strut. It's one of my favorite songs by them, but I'm going to play Short Dress Gal in part because it has vocals. And so again, this is one of the themes of the 1920s is New Orleans bands start to finally adapt to a vocalized song.
looking, Lord bad. All my kids want to Lord bad. Everybody looking for shine drag, no more style.
And I'm going to stop this right there. Unfortunately, we're running short on time, but that was Jim Robinson on the trombone solo at the very end, also known for being one of the stars of Preservation Hall in the 1960s and 70s. But what I appreciate about that song is that um, it's almost like a gospel style song in the way it's sung. And then, indeed, part of the Sam Morgan Band repertoire included Over in Glory Land. So they had a mix of both secular and sacred in their repertoire. So, sorry. So that brings up Monk Hazel and his Bienville Roof Orchestra, another of the popular white bands of this time period. And so the Bienville Hotel is on Lee Circle. Today it is a nursing home, and I can't remember the name of it, but it's right on the kind of the riverside of Lee Circle. And so there's a picture of the Monk Hazel and his Bienville Orchestra. And then they also recorded in 1927 in part of this wave of recording companies coming down. And so Brunswick and then Get With It, I'm going to play that. Oh, wait, sorry. I'm going to play Sizzling Blues just because I love the guitar is quite subtle on this. I'm going to play a sample of it. So anyway, I wish we could hear more of that, but I encourage you all to check it out. But Monk Hazel was a drummer, and his band sounds great. And so it's no wonder that Brunswick decided to record them in 1927 on that huge wave of recordings in New Orleans. But unfortunately, we're out of time. That brings up Lee Collins. And so this is a picture from Lee Collins on tour in Texas during this time. And he includes a female band member. I'm not sure what her role was, perhaps singer. But he obviously has a piano player, and that's Lee right there. And they also recorded in 1929 for Astoria Records. And the duet stomp, I'm just going to give you all a sample of. So that's Lee on trumpet right there. So unfortunately, we're going to have to stop right there. But the end of the song has a scatting chorus, which I think is influenced by Louis Armstrong, and also I think Lee Collins, based on his style, is also influenced by Louis Armstrong. The way he held that high note throughout his solo is very much a style of Louis. And then um, I will I will indulge for a second here, but the rhythm they're playing right here, don't. That's the Charleston rhythm, which of course is associated with really more of a New York, but but it again it shows the influence of national styles overall. Bum 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 bum. So the Jones and Collins Astoria Hot Eight, actually named after the Astoria Hotel, which is on South Rampart. And so South Rampart Street between Canal and, let's say, Gerard was one of the centers of African American entertainment. And so there were a lot of clubs in that area, but the Astoria Hotel was very important in terms of that. And so they actually had a standing gig there, and so that's one of the hotel gigs that existed for bands such as the Jones, Collins, Astoria 8 back in that time. So that I'm trying to move quickly here. We only have a few minutes, but that brings up Captain John Handy and the Louisiana Shakers, who also toured the Gulf Coast. And so Captain John Handy featured on the left on the tenor saxophone there. And so his band toured the Gulf Coast. And so you can see, especially this picture here of his band, the tropical theme is very typical of the 1920s and may be held over into the early 1930s. And also, for those of you all who may remember Lionel Fairbose, the great trumpeter from New Orleans who lived until his hundreds, this is Lionel right here, second from left on the front row. Um, and so I'm going to move on. Buddy Petite Band in Mandeville in the 1920s. So Buddy Petite, drummer from Mandeville. And then what is interesting is his singer with the megaphone. This is the way singers sang back in those days before microphones, is Leon Rene. And Leon Rene actually wrote Sleepy Time Down South, which is one of Louis Armstrong's theme songs. And he moved to Los Angeles in the 1930s. And Louis, when he moved to Los Angeles in the 1930s, would actually go to the Rene brothers' house, Leon and Otis, for gumbo. And that was his kind of comfort food. And you can see all the other band members there, including Edmund Hall, right here on clarinet, and Chester Zardis, both of whom are famous musicians in their own right. And that brings us to Edmund Hall and Cootie Williams. And so Edmund Hall worked the Gulf Coast circuit. And at one point, they were working with a band in Mobile for an extended stay. And Cootie Williams, who was a trumpeter from Mobile, worked with Edmund Hall. And then when the band broke up, most of the band members went back to New Orleans. But meanwhile, Edmund Hall and Cootie Williams moved to Florida. And then from Jacksonville, Florida, they moved up to New York. And so the kind of the short story is Edmund Hall and Cootie Williams became associated with some of the top bands in the country. So Cootie Williams, known as the great trumpeter of the Duke Ellington Orchestra. And so the wah-wah sound that you hear in St. Louis Toodaloo, for example, was heavily influenced by the trumpet style of the New Orleans musicians. And then Edmund Hall went on to play with a number of greats, including Louis Armstrong. He's included in the movie High Society from the 1950s, et cetera. So that brings us to our last slide here, and that is Frankie Dewson and his son in the 1920s. And that brings up the fact that African-American musicians traveling throughout the South during this time period of Jim Crow segregation faced a number of obstacles, and they had to be very aware of where they were going, where they were going to stop. They had to plan the whole trip out. They had to be very careful. And so even an African American owning an automobile and traveling throughout the South could be potentially, dangerous in many ways. And so for many of these Black musicians, as they traveled the Gulf Coast circuit, they had to be very, very careful. So I wanted to point that out. And so I like this picture. This is from the Hogan Jazz Archive. Frankie with his essentially his Model T in the 1920s. And so to conclude, finally, we're here. So the 1920s, New Orleans jazz dance market provided steady jobs for many musicians, and that is in contrast to the Storyville Exodus myth of the jazz diaspora. So New Orleans did have a thriving jazz scene in the 1920s, as did all of the Gulf Coast. So Hollywood, Frederick Ramsey, and Charles Edward Smith of Jazzmen. I'm sorry, but you're wrong. And then the dance market included hotels. That includes the Bienville for Monk Hazel and the Astoria for the Jones Collins Band, the Pythian Temple Roof Garden on Loyola Street, the Southern Yacht Club, a number of dance halls, including the Halfway House, and all the ones in the Tango Belt that we mentioned, as well as riverboat excursions. And then there's also the Gulf Coast Circuit. So a network of dance halls along the Gulf Coast. It's a regional circuit similar to the territory bands circuit of the Midwest, which gave rise to modern swing with Count Basie and Benny Moten in that time period of the late 30s. And then also importantly, the record companies, OK, Columbia, Victor, Brunswick, all see New Orleans as a potential source of jazz recordings. And so this is where we find that these bands that I played you tonight are able to be recorded, which is great because it's for the first time that we actually have New Orleans bands recorded in New Orleans. And then also the context of segregation certainly complicated travel for African American musicians in the South. So 1920s dance band market in New Orleans and the Gulf Coast circuit. I hope you all learned a lot. I'm open to any questions.
Thank you, Charles.
Yeah.
You had to have learned a lot. This was a lot of great information here, and it was no loss of bands to go see. That's for sure. So we've got a couple questions here. I got a couple from Alan Raphael. The first one he asked was, I think it was called Barataria Blues.
Yeah, Barataria, actually.
Just Barataria? Okay,
yeah.
Barataria was recorded in New Orleans. Any idea where? And I would ask you a broader question.
Yeah.
Where were these bands recording in New Orleans?
That's a great question. I was wondering that myself, actually. And I think from just kind of the back of my mind, I think they were recorded at the hotels where some of these bands played. And also, I didn't mention, but they would do radio broadcasts from some of the hotels, the ballrooms. And so I think that's where they did them. That would make the most sense. So,
and it wasn't what is now the Ritz-Carlton, wasn't that it was a department store, but it also had a radio station in there as well.
Right? Yeah, I believe so. Yeah.
So that might be another place where they might have recorded.
Or even the top of the Bienville Hotel, I think was where some recordings were made, actually, or even radio broadcasts were made.
Alan also asked, I believe it's Bebe Ridgely. Is Bebe Ridgely the father of Tommy Ridgely?
That's a great question. I don't know. I mean, Tommy Ridgely and Bebe are related. And so Tommy is from Shrewsbury. And so for those of you all who are not familiar with that part of Jefferson Parish, if you're going up River Road past Oxnard, right past Oxnard is the kind of the old community of Shrewsbury. And so Tommy Ridgely was a blues musician who used to work Bourbon Street in the, I want to say the 70s and the 80s. But yes, Bebe and Tommy are related. I'm not sure exactly how they are related, but yes, same family. And then, I mean, that brings up the subject that, there's so many families in New Orleans who have multiple generations of musicians. So Alan, great questions. Thank you for asking. You stumped me on part of that, but hopefully we'll resolve some of these soon.
As someone once told me, the game is 7 connections between Kevin Bacon in New Orleans. It's 4 connections to a relative.
I
So
would say 3.
3.
Yeah.
And anybody else has any other questions, please put them in the chat. I've got one more here, but I'd love to hear any other questions. What was the access to the public of these recordings, and how common were someone to have a record player in their house at this time frame?
Okay, good question. So I always used Louis Armstrong as an example of affordability of a phonograph during this time period. So Louis, who, I mean, he was not even middle class. He was pretty much struggling and working all his life. And so even in the late 19 teens, he had a phonograph. So Edison, the phonograph company, made phonographs so affordable that, basically working class people could buy them. And so Lewis bought the ODJV record Tiger Rag and other records by Enrique Caruso or whoever. And so it became so common that just about everybody had a phonograph in their house. And so this was considered kind of a standard of consumption and living at that time. And so, I also argued that phonographs, because they were so common, really helped spread the style. And so the fact that jazz came out right as the phonograph became affordable helped to spread the style internationally overall. And then even within New Orleans, I mean, people who lived in New Orleans and they could listen to bands from New York and then also understand all that style. So I hope
Yeah,
that answers
yeah,
the
it
question.
definitely does. And it actually, if you kind of put it in context with the rollout of the television set,
Yeah,
the phonograph was so much more accessible for people and
right,
provided tons more content very
right.
early on compared to the TV, few
Yeah,
TVs overall, and the one TV in a house kind of thing, and
yeah.
it was the biggest purchase in the whole family. So, um, yeah, that absolutely answered it. So, if we don't have any other questions, I want to thank Charles for week 2 of 6. We'll see him back next week for the Goodson sisters. He's kind of teased it a little bit, so I'm excited to hear more about these very talented ladies. And we'll see everybody next week at 4 p.m. New Orleans time, and we look forward to seeing everybody. And if you haven't signed up for next week, just let us know. You can either email myself, or you can email, or you can sign up. You can sign up for all of them. You can sign up for one of them. If you'd like to be signed up for all of them, just you can email me, and I will just do it all in one big sweep. So thank you so much, Charles, and have a good
Sure.
night. And everyone else, thank you for attending.
Likewise. Thanks. All right. Good night.
Thank you, Charles.
All right. Bye bye.